What I want to do tonight, however, is really talk about a personal response. This talk tonight is going to take two forms, or two strands. One is a very much a personal reaction to Blake. This is a book which has taken me 30 years to write, in the sense that I was speaking to some students earlier this evening about my interest in Blake, which began when I was 19 years old, and I came across a copy of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and for reasons which will become quite clear, I think, as I talk, literally turned my own personal world upside down. The lights went on and they've never gone off in all that time. It's interesting, I've written on various other writers, figures, activities, and after a while I get bored and move on to something else. William Blake is a figure who I never, ever get bored of. And actually, I'm already stacking up the future 2, 3, 4 projects that I want to begin work on Blake, to explore different facets of his art and writing. So, as well as some of these personal responses, which will come through in some of the images and texts that I've chosen to talk about tonight, I also want to track through something of, argument is too fanciful a word, but some of the reactions in Blake, sorry, my personal reactions, so responses of my own part to Blake's thinking, his art, his writing about religion in particular. And that itself, religion is a contentious word, but Blake's thoughts on the divine in their widest aspects. And that's one thing that actually writing this book, I deal very much with Blake's life, clearly. It's intended as much as anything as comprehensive as possible, a guide to his works. And I mean, beginning with the engravings he performed, the work he began as an apprentice to James Bezier in the 1770s, going through to those final unfinished manuscripts that he was working on, the illuminated sketches for the Book of Genesis, for the Book of Enoch, etc. I've tried in Divine Images to be as comprehensive to the quality and range of Blake's works as possible. That's given a particular great pleasure for me. For the first time, I've been writing about Blake for a very, very long time. And not to impugn any of my publishers don't usually like printing a lot of images, truth be told. And one of the things that attracted me to this particular project with Reaction was that they wanted a lavishly illustrated book. There's over 100 illustrations to accompany the 90-odd thousand words that I've written. And so it's given me a great opportunity to write about Blake's art in some detail, as well as his poetry. What I'm going to do in terms then of the specifics of the examples, as it were, of the works that I want to look at is really just to focus on 5 particular texts. I can, and frequently do, talk about Blake for hour after hour after hour, but in the remaining 30 odd minutes that are left to me, I want to focus on 5 specific examples, which for me are incredibly illuminating ways of examining how Blake approaches the subject of the divine. The one that I'll begin with should be familiar to all of you, certainly the majority of you, and provided the title for this particular book, which is The Divine Image, Blake's Song of Innocence, which he first published in 1789. I won't read the whole poem out, but it begins famously: to mercy, pity, peace, and love all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. And what I particularly want to end, I've given there the quotation which ends this particular poem, this particular lyric. And all must love the human form, in heathen, Turk, or Jew, where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. And the reason for starting with this particular poem is that actually it is my own personal favorite of all of Blake's works. This is if I had to have one poem inscribed on my tombstone, this would be the poem. This, for me, I've not lived up to it, but it's been an attempt to form. If I have a credo, it is this poem. And I want to begin by tracing through why this poem has been so profoundly affecting upon myself. So I first began studying Blake. It was actually as an undergraduate course. So I was reading a degree in English literature, and in our second year, we had to do a module on romanticism, which, at that point, Byron was my go-to man, followed by Coleridge. I'd long been interested in the Romantics, but for want of a better word, it was the flashier end of the Romantic movement that interested me as a young man. And during that course, I read The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and one thing that I'm going to sort of drip feed throughout this talk are some of the personal reactions, why Blake has been so important to me as an individual. So at that stage, I was still really going through a transition from having been a very, come from a very profoundly religious family. I was raised, the cliche is a strict Catholic family. That doesn't really explain it, but for various reasons, one of which I will come to at the end of this talk, religion, and particularly Catholicism, was incredibly important to me growing up. So much so that for a long period of time, I actually wanted to become a priest. That seemed to me the only vocation worth following. For a whole host of reasons, which I will not go into this evening, that very quickly began to unravel when I went to university. I think you can probably imagine, a young, good Catholic boy being let away from home. The world did not follow its preordained path. And so I was going through an incredibly profound spiritual crisis. I just didn't really understand it. I didn't know it at the time. And it was during this period that I first encountered Blake. And that encounter with The Marriage of Heaven and Hell was particularly important because when I often summarize this for students, I begin by saying, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, this short pamphlet, which Blake writes in 1790, is one of the most astonishing books ever written, in which Blake basically says, everything you know about everything is wrong. I am on the side of the devils, and everything you have ever been taught and the nature of God should come instead from the devil's party. Now, that's, for a young Catholic lad, that was a hammer blow, which shattered apart my ways of thinking. And I've spent the past 30 years plus reconstructing myself, my ideas from those shards which scattered. But I kind of want to draw attention then to a more benign aspect of Blake to begin with, which is, for me, encapsulated by this poem, The Divine Image. And there's a couple of points, one of which will be particularly important for this talk this evening. And indeed, throughout the book is something I try to draw attention to again and again. And that is that the divine image, this notion of God, I'll use that. Blake uses that word, so I'll go with that for the moment. But this notion of God is something that very much stems not from a system of beliefs, not from a series of dogma. It stems instead from a particular practice. And one of the things that I would particularly draw attention to is that for a poet who wants to locate the divine in the human form divine, there's a whole host of adjectives that you could choose, powerful, wise, all-seeing, omnipotent, omniscient, typical words that have been used to describe the deity over the centuries, over the millennia. But Blake focuses upon mercy, pity, peace, and love. What it is to be divine for Blake is to exercise these particular virtues. And actually, one of the things that I'll start to move throughout this talk is actually just how profoundly important those virtues are to Blake, and in particular to his vision of Christ, his Christology, which is founded not, and this is why I think Blake is so important as a thinker, as a writer, as an artist, is that for him, the fundamentals of our relationships with each other are established upon these particular virtues. Now, throughout his poetry elsewhere, at this moment, I'm reducing Blake to a series of quatrains, a series of incredibly simple verses that appear in Songs of Innocence. And throughout his poetry, you'll find Rintrah full of rage. You'll find Orc, the spirit of rebellion. I'd even argue at certain points that Urizen, as the spirit of reason, in his original unfallen form, is a son of light, is actually a figure to be considered as virtuous before he attempts to overstep his boundaries. But actually, it's these very, very fundamental and incredibly simple ideals which Blake espouses as fundamental to our understanding of religion. And also, as somebody who's worked in higher education now for 20 odd years, mercy, pity, peace, and love are virtues which will be practiced more often, I think, than by children than academics. And this, again, is something that's fundamental to how Blake approaches his understanding of the self to the external world and also the divine world. So the divine image, I say, it's kind of a personal plea that this is, for me, one of the most perfect poems ever written. I mean, I memorized it many, many years ago and I frequently recite it to myself. It's almost like a little daily prayer that I kind of tell myself to try and sustain me in those hours of darkness. But I actually want to move now back to closer to the beginning of Blake's career. And actually, for me, what is one of the most profound commentaries that Blake offered on the nature of divinity, on the nature of religion. And this is one of his first illuminated books, his first experiments in stereotype printing, produced in the 1780s and given the title, there's two of them together, I'm just going to concentrate on All Religions Are One. And his other companion title, There Is No Natural Religion. And I will just read the verses here. I don't know how many people have read these aphorisms. They're actually, while short, incredibly dense. And I could spend a very long time untangling these. I just want to draw attention to one or two features. Principle. First, that the poetic genius is the true man, and that the body or outward form of man is derived from the poetic genius. Likewise, that the forms of all things are derived from their genius, which by the ancients was called an angel and spirit and demon. Second, as all men are alike in outward form, so, and with the same infinite variety, all are alike in their poetic genius. Third, no man can think, write, or speak from his heart, but he must intend truth. Thus, all sects of philosophy are from the poetic genius adapted to the weaknesses of every individual. 4, as none by travelling over known lands can find out the unknown, so from already acquired knowledge man could not acquire more. Therefore, a universal poetic genius exists. 5, the religions of all nations are derived from each nation's different reception of the poetic genius, which is everywhere called the spirit of prophecy. 6, the Jewish and Christian testaments are an original derivation from the poetic genius. This is necessary from the confined nature of bodily sensation. So I said, this is actually incredibly dense text. And I'm going to spend, 5 minutes just untangling. And there's one very important point that I want to return to, and that is this notion of poetic genius. Before discussing that, however, I want to just draw attention to just how incredibly profound Blake was as a thinker about the nature of the divine, the nature of Enlightenment philosophy in his earlier years. This is a text that, amongst other things, reacts incredibly strongly to the works of John Locke. And this, along with Newton, along with Francis Bacon, John Locke was one of the figures whom philosophically Blake set himself up most in opposition. And again, forgive me at this moment for simplifying, and I'll be very happy for discussion, correction, amendments, discourse later on. But I'm going to simplify what, for me at this moment in this talk, is the most important point about this relationship to Locke. And that is that for Locke, the source of self, the source of our identity of who we become, is entirely external. Locke famously described the mind of an infant, the mind of a newly born person, as a tabula rasa, that blank slate upon which the external world leaves its impressions. And thus our minds are formed by a reaction to these external events, these external impressions. Blake utterly, and I cannot emphasize this enough, utterly opposed that. The mind is not formed by a reaction to external sense impressions, but rather takes those sense impressions and through the poetic genius, which I think Northrop Frye was correct to give a simpler name, imagination, that what Blake insisted upon is that it is the act of imagination which shapes our sense of the world around us. Now, he was not some simple solipsist idealist. His argument was never that the mind simply creates the external world and sort of like some of those later German idealists, that the sense of self is everything and projects onto the world. No. For Blake, imagination takes sense impressions. He again and again draws attention to the importance of the senses. But his epistemology, his sense of how we perceive the world around us, is fundamentally tied to the way in which the active drive of energy, of imagination, of desire reacts to those sense impressions that fall upon us. So Blake fundamentally turns Lockean epistemology, a notion of empiricism, on its head. And this is the second point with regard to religion that I really want to just focus on for a moment. About 10 years ago, the religious philosopher Stephen Prothero released actually a really significant book. It's not very long. I do recommend everybody, if you're interested in subjects of theology of world religions, to read it. And the title is All Religions Are Not One. And it starts off with a quotation, the opening of William Blake, all religions are one. And Prothero says, in the 18th century, we find the beginning of this notion that all religions are the same, emerging with William Blake, who said that, everybody believes the same thing. No, it's quite clear that Stephen Prothero, he's probably read All Religions as One, but he's not really read past the title, and he certainly hasn't understood what Blake is saying. What Blake is saying is that all religions are one is because all religions are products of the imagination. All religions are made up. They are invented. What Blake is talking about here is the necessary spirit of invention that motivates us to find out, to create, to invent the world around us. As he mentioned, as none by traveling over known lands can find out the unknown, so from already acquired knowledge, man could not inquire more. We have to invent. Knowledge is driven not simply by passively receiving information from the external world, but by actively going out to acquire that knowledge. Now, what I'd like to do, as I've mentioned it several times already, is to pick a third insightful moment, which for me is actually one of the most important texts that Blake ever wrote. I myself have written on it now about half a dozen times. And this is plate 11 from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And in this text, Blake gives an account of the origins of religion. He gives, I think in many respects, a more amenable approach to that rather abstract arguments that he presented in All Religions Are One. So I'll read the text first, and then what I want to do is actually go through a brief analysis and exposition of this particular plate, of what it means, and also actually why it's been so important to me. The ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by the names and adorning them with the properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their enlarged and numerous senses could perceive. And particularly, they studied the genius of each city and country, placing it under its mental deity, till a system was formed, which some took advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Thus began priesthood, choosing forms of worship from poetic tales. And at length, they pronounced that the gods had ordered such things. Thus men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. Now, for me, this plate is one of the most astonishing things, not simply that Blake wrote, but indeed for me, it kind of strips away a whole raft of kind of comparative religious studies. You know, this largely, in terms of his philosophical ideas, this largely self-educated man, for me, gets to the nub of religion far better than pretty much any theologian of his age. And what we see here, I mean, when I first wrote about this text, I was fascinated about how it very much operated within the intellectual contexts and currents of Blake's day. I mean, I'd been introduced to Blake as a romantic. You know, I'd been introduced to Blake as the person who attempted to overthrow Newton, the writer, the artist who wanted to turn the world of Locke and Bacon upside down, who was opposed to the Enlightenment in every sense, that your reason, was the big baddie of all of Blake's works. Now, in the 1990s, I mean, pretty much the time that I got into Blake and started studying him, there was a considerable movement amongst a number of Romanticism scholars to actually get Blake removed from that particular category. I'm not going to mention names, but I've been involved in a number of conversations with people who teach, you know, academics who will teach the Romantic period on a regular basis, and they go, you know, so if you study and you write about Wordsworth, then clearly you're going to have a link into Coleridge, and actually, you know, that second generation. I'll just stick with the big five, leave Blake to one side for the moment. You know, that second generation of the big Romantic figures, Byron, Shelley, Keats, etc., are responding to that first generation. So you see immediately that when you study one author, you will then have an understanding or an affinity to the ideas of another from that period. and some very respected romantics. And then they come to Blake and go, what the hell is Bola Hula? You know, Golgonooza, what's that? You have to literally learn this new vocabulary. The other romantics, yes, they may experiment, they may push the boundaries of classical and indeed world mythologies, but they don't make it up from scratch, which Blake, of course, with his Zoas and his whole series of spectres and emanations, etc., creates this system from scratch. So Blake's whole poetic and artistic practice is an attempt to put into motion what he describes here in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. That for Blake, religion, and that's a dangerous word to use actually at this juncture, because there's a very strong argument that, you know, Blake, the author, the poet of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, is against religion, at least at this point. But forgive me, I tend to avoid words like spirituality, etc., in my own writing as being a bit woolly, if I'm honest. So Blake's approach to the divine is very much based upon the notion that the divine, religion, our spiritual lives, is an act of imagination. We make stuff up. We invent gods. We invent systems of understanding the world around us. And what he does here, and this is very much in line, for example, you know, David Hume, the philosopher, in his account of natural religion, the development of religion, which goes back to, La Vita Nuova, La Scienza Nuova, the new science of Vico in the late 17th century. These Enlightenment thinkers were very much relating kind of religion to human activity, and their principal concern was effectively to undermine religion, to demolish it, to show that it was just one human activity amongst many. Blake himself, I mean, you know, if we stick with the word that Blake uses, priesthood, Blake is very much part of that agenda. Blake wants to demolish the power structures that come out of conventional religion. But what Blake wants to replace religion with is not reason, is not the project of the Enlightenment as carried through by figures such as Hume. He wants to replace it with poetry. He wants to replace it with poesis, with making, with invention, with what for Blake is the fundamental activity that makes us human. For Blake, art is fundamental to what we do. Without art, we are not human. If we are not human, we cannot be divine, because we cannot invent the world of the divine. Everything for Blake is supernatural because it is our act of invention, our act of making, our acts of poetry that invents nature, the supernatural. There's no dichotomy for these terms. It's only when we try to restrict our perceptions, we no longer operate with these enlarged and numerous senses that will decide. I mean, a very good example of this for me is, I think it's recorded by Crab Robinson, the conversation where he says, somebody asks him that when he goes out and looks at the sun, does he see, a gold disc about the size of a guinea? And says, no, I see a host of angels rising up and singing, hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. I can't remember the exact quote. But, Blake sees the same object that any other man, woman, or child sees in the street. But when he sees it, he sees a host of angels. And another day he might see, I don't know, Urizen carrying it as a torch, or he might see it lost, lifting it out of the darkness. Every day, Blake can invent the world of objects around him because he is an artist, he is a poet. T. Hume, in his essay on classicism and romanticism, referred to romanticism as spilled religion, as kind of what's left when the impulse that we all have to pursue something larger than ourselves gets removed from religion. It says it kind of falls into this weaker form of aesthetics. Blake actually turns that around completely. Religion, priesthood, what we understand by conventional religion, is spilled poetry. It's the moment when we forget that we can recreate the world of the divine again and again and again. And for Blake, this is something that children do naturally. They go out into the woods or the world around them, they play games, they simply perceive the world through these enlarged senses. What I want to do now is actually, rather than talking about religion in these very general terms, I now want to return to Blake's kind of his understanding of Christ, of Jesus in particular. And what for me are two incredibly astonishing examples of just how willing Blake is to rewrite the Bible. I still, after 30 years of this, I still cannot get over just how radical and how daring Blake is when it comes to reading the Bible. I know of no other author who is a Christian, who is a true believer, who is also willing to invent, to demonstrate his approach to this relationship to the divine. And I want to give two examples, and for me, two really profound examples. So the first is taken from Blake's illustrations to the book of Job. Actually, sorry, it's not as large. I really should have enlarged this picture. My temptation to be clever and give two versions, the painted version for Thomas Butts, and then the final engraved version that appears in the edition he does for Linnell in the 1820s. It's actually the edition from Linnell I want to concentrate on, because I must be honest, I find the Butts one slightly creepy. I'll return to that in a moment. But the Linnell version, the famous hand-engraved versions, actually takes a single line from the book of Job. I've heard with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye seeth thee. Blake takes this single line, and this appears towards the end of the book of Job, after that famous speech in which Jehovah, God, appears out of the cloud, out of the hurricane, and tells Job, canst thou draw up Leviathan? Canst thou draw him up with a hook? Basically, I am God. I can make everything. I'm all powerful. In the Linnell version, the text that surrounds, so the writing that surrounds that central, beautiful, incredibly delicately crafted illustration, is largely drawn from the Gospel of John. It's very much establishing, Christ as the incarnation of the Father. But for me, this is actually where an example of where Blake's Christology is incredibly profound. The book of Job, amongst, sort of the Edomites who originally composed this story, did not include any reference whatsoever to Jesus Christ, to, the coming of the Messiah, of an incarnation of God in human form. This is entirely Blake's invention. And for me, it's a momentary, fascinating insight into some of the processes by which Blake works. Now, one of the arguments, and which I could trace through much greater detail, is Blake is engaging in a long-established, a millennia-long tradition of typology, of looking into the Old Testament for precursors of the New Testament. Examples where, in the prophets, in the histories, etc., whereby, Christian theologians and writers would draw attention and say, this is a precursor of Christ's testimony. I think that line, my ears have heard thee, but now my eyes seeth thee, is really stretching the typology argument. Blake is looking for an important connection. And what Blake illustrates at this point, this is the turning point for Job. This is the moment at which Job realizes that his own understanding of religion has been flawed, and that of his friends has been deeply flawed. Job has a moment of recognizing that it is he who creates God. So the point I was just making is that with regard to Blake's Christology in Job, this is the moment at which Job recognizes that he is inventing the figure of God that has been punishing him. And this section, I'll end then and open up to questions. My apologies for the microphone. The joys of little lapel microphones. I just then want to talk about this final image of Abraham and Isaac. And hopefully people can still hear me. What I'll just draw attention to in this particular image is the posture of both Abraham and Isaac. Of course, according to the story, the very well-known story, Abraham is ordered, instructed by God to take his son and offer him in sacrifice. When he comes to the mountaintop and he constructs the altar, so at the last moment, God intervenes and tells him, no, you don't need to kill your son. And Abraham at that moment sees a ram, which he sacrifices instead. I mean, historically, it's possible that this deals with, ancient Semitic traditions, whereby the Hebrews moved from forms of human sacrifice to a substitute with animal sacrifice. The important point, and this is just a final example of how Blake rewrites the Bible or re-illustrates the Bible. I'll just draw attention here. The posture of Abraham. Abraham standing at the altar, the knife in his hand, looking up to heaven, is his eyes open but unseeing. He's completely trapped in his own mental world. The terrifying thing about this picture is that there's no God telling Abraham to do it. The God that instructed Abraham to kill his son is actually entirely his own invention. It's this spectral voice which has instructed him that proper religion is the sacrifice of others. And also, in this image, it is not Abraham who sees the ram, but his son Isaac. In other words, Abraham, the druidic, sacrificial, cultish figure, is still willing to kill his son. It's the naked, Christ-like son who says, there is an alternative way. Religion does not need to proceed through the sacrifice of humans and of children. So this is an incredibly important example of how Blake, by placing religion in the human, by making us responsible for our own knowledge of the divine, we are the ones who shape the supernatural world. We are the ones who create those images. And that, for me, is why Blake still remains one of the most important prophets. Thank you very much. And my apologies for the glitch with the microphone.
Wow.
So I'll open now for any questions. And also, I guess, just to say, Divine Images, the life and works of William Blake will be available from the 12th of April from all good booksellers, assuming we can all go into booksellers at that point, other than just Amazon. So thank you very much. And I shall stop sharing the screen and open up for any questions or comments.